These Ipswich Town players are defying the odds.
Hello and welcome back to TWTV, where you join me, Jim Cooper, for another special segment where we're looking at interesting content being developed around Ipswich Town. And I'm joined by Richard Popple to talk about a really interesting and compelling podcast documentary called Rolling with the Punches. And Richard, welcome on board. Welcome to TWTV.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
And let's sort of let's start actually, if it's all right, with a little bit about yourself and a little bit about your Ipswich supporting history.
Yeah, well, I grew up in Ipswich sort of in the 90s, early noughties, and obviously I've been a Town fan kind of since that time, really. The early 90s was when I first went to the games. So yeah, I've always had this kind of connection with the place and the club, and, you know, I don't live there anymore, but I've obviously still got family there and stuff, and go back for games very, very often. So yeah, it kind of means a lot to me, and I think a couple of years ago, I guess, I started to think about wanting to do something, a kind of creative project around the town or the club. And then I sort of had a bit of an epiphany to do this, I suppose, the podcast series, and started making it about a year and a half ago is when it kind of like started the development.
Yeah, I think I think a real positive thing about Ipswich's recent success is some of the content that's been created around it. You know, we've had some really good content from sort of the Blue Monday team for a while.
Yeah.
And now there's a bit. We've recently had Marcus Parrott on the show talking about his illustrated review of the last two Ipswich seasons. And it's great to kind of, you know, join you today to hear about a documentary. And I've got to say, it's really well produced. It's got a lovely style to it. Give us a little bit more of an insight into what was the original idea about it? What was the inspiration for it?
The inspiration, I suppose, was kind of twofold, really. One was kind of a personal question of why I care so much, or why one cares about a football club so much. And the other was, I think after the first promotion, the League One to the Championship, there was this massive like outpouring of emotion and celebration and stuff, and the streets were full, and that party atmosphere was so missed in the town. And everyone just came together in that kind of like moment. And it reminded me of the sort of 2000 promotion of my generation and stuff. And then a few days later, the town was kind of back to being empty again. And I kind of just thought, what is the impact of something like this? How can you grab those kind of like moments and make it something bigger? So I suppose that's where we kind of like started from. And then we started to think, well, what is the role of a football club in a place? I don't think there's been that many kind of stories or investigations into that. There's been a few kind of like fiscal kind of looks at it, you know, the Brighton thing with like how much of the economy is going to be affected and stuff. But generally speaking, what happens on the ground day to day about how a town can sort of jump on the back of a football club's success, you don't really see that many stories about it. So I think I wanted to get into the town. I wanted to meet the people who are there every day, who are trying to build businesses there and lives there and stuff, and find out whether the football club can kind of, in some way, help with that by osmosis or directly. I don't know. So that's where the investigation started.
Yeah, and you take me back to that day of promotion, you know, up to the Premier League. You're absolutely right. That connection between the town itself, the outpouring, you know, hundreds of people, if not more, coming into the town, not even to go to the ground, just to be there for the event. And then afterwards, the Ipswich Borough Council coming out and cleaning up the town in almost a partnership sense. So yeah, great times and a really excellent documentary. I really want to delve into some of the points you made about that connection to the town. But before we do that, the documentary starts looking back on sort of slightly darker times for town. And we look back at the Marcus Evans era and some of the challenges, relegation into League One. What did you take from that time? How bad was the club? What were your takeaways from looking back at that period of time?
I mean, I just remember looking at Ipswich kind of like from afar. You know, you would go to games because you could get tickets easily. For a decade or more, anyone could get a ticket. So, you know, whenever I went back, I would try and go to a game or whatever. And the atmosphere was it was awful, really. The football was bad, obviously. But it was just the connection between the fans and the community and the club. It was just not there. It was just eroding. And I think that was the thing that was so stark about it. All right, the football was bad. We were losing games and we weren't doing very well. But it was just the atmosphere around the whole place. And so I think we spoke to Max Helm on the podcast from Blue Action, who obviously were one of the first people to try and galvanise the club. You know, and that was a bad moment. That was 2018, when they started. So Max deserves a lot of credit, and the guys that helped him along the way to try and like build some atmosphere back in the stadium. So when we started with the podcast, we needed to go to that kind of like low moment because it seemed an obvious kind of narrative starting point. You know, you kind of start at the bottom and then we try and work our way up, work out how we got there, which is, you know, the whole Evans kind of era. We had Simon Clegg on talking about that very honestly, very openly, which was kind of like fascinating to hear that kind of side of things.
I think it was interesting. He really did open up to me, and it's interesting you call out the Blue Action guys, because you know you almost pinpoint that moment where they went to the train, they went to Playford Road, and they had that moment of protest, because you're right, it was broken, the disconnect was there. So carry on. Anything else from that kind of look back that you can tell us about?
I think we also had Kieran Maguire on the podcast, who was somebody who, you know, football finance expert, is incredibly eloquent about that side of the game, and obviously gave me a load of information that I just wouldn't have had beforehand. And I think he just sums up the kind of the importance of why you need to ask who runs your football club and why they're running your football club. You know, Marcus Evans was famously very aloof, famously didn't really give the fans much of his own reasoning for being involved, particularly. And I think that more than anything led to the breakdown of the relationship. Fast forward to when Game Changer came along, and it was kind of like chalk and cheese. You know, you get people coming in who are talking and being open about why they're there, what they're trying to do, and everything else. And I think that level of respect towards the fans and the community is required. And so I think in the first couple of episodes, there is a lot around why it matters who runs your club, and we, even in the good times, you should still keep asking what are they going to do with it, you know, in the next few years, when are they going to go, and all the rest of it. I think if the club belongs to the fans, as the cliche goes, then I think we have a responsibility to keep asking those questions.
And I think talking about the club belonging to the fans, but it's all that connection to the town. And I think the episode you've got around that you call Place Behind the Badge, and I think that's a really strong episode for me. Let's talk a little bit more about that connection between the club and the town itself. Interestingly, Mark Ashton said that, you know, the town almost has to come at the same pace as those. And I'd ask you the question, is it the town's responsibility or the club's responsibility? How does it work, that relationship, do you think?
I think that was one of the great kind of like questions I was sort of asking with it. A lot of people look at a football club and say it's got nothing to do with, the town has nothing to do with them. You know, their responsibility is to win football matches, to entertain people, and to look after themselves, and that's fair enough. That's how some people see a football club. I think the club and the town have obviously been together, or partners or whatever, for longer than any of us have been around. Any ownership, any fan, anyone. So I think that relationship is very, very unique, and the club itself is so ingrained in the identity of Ipswich. It's the biggest brand we have. It's the one thing that everybody knows about that town, apart from Ed Sheeran maybe. And so that has to be important, and that relationship has to be nurtured. And I think it might not be a direct sort of, you know, monetary transaction between the two, whereas, you know, the club directly sort of investing in the town. I mean, that may happen. We don't know with the ownership group and stuff. But I think it's more of a sense of like the club can help the town's identity. It can help it feel good about itself and like the perception. And Ipswich struggles with a bit of a negative perception.
I think that's right. And you get the new local MP on as well. And we all can see that the Ipswich town centre is struggling, you know. Right. And I think it's about how, you know, the town has a lot going for it. You know, it has the water side, it has the parks, it has the culture. It's just whether the club and the town, can go in step together, can't they, and see that improvement. Anything else about that connection? Who else did you speak to in around Ipswich itself?
So Kate Riley was on there, who used to be a BBC reporter, and she now lives in Singapore and is the chair of the Singapore Supporters Club. And Kate was brilliant at basically saying that, you know, the club have done amazingly to kind of like drag themselves up from where they were 3 years ago, and they deserve a huge amount of credit for that. But she wants to see that kind of like spotlight being shone a little bit further and being opened up to other people. And then we had business owners and stuff in the town. You mentioned like Jack Abbott, obviously the MP, who was, again, very open and honest, and I think very illuminating about how he sees the football club helping with the town. And he's got a very ambitious kind of remit for the next few years, which is exciting potentially for Ipswich. Joe Bailey, I'm going to give a shout out because Brighton the Corners are just an incredible organisation, like a not-for-profit music organisation doing incredible things in Ipswich. And actually their artists feature on our podcast a lot. So
Yeah.
the music that you hear on the podcast, a lot of that is local and regional musicians.
I thought that stood out actually as another thing going on in Ipswich that's lifting the place, and that festival continues to go from strength to strength. Let's move into some of the good times then. So we've got the new ownership group. Lots of things happening there. You mentioned the fact that they talk themselves about being custodians of the club, and that's what they are. I like that messaging. They say they're there for a period of time, but in that period of time already, they've built the value up to a mind-boggling amount. I think on the show you mentioned £200 million valuation now. But Ashton's been a driving force in this. Mark Ashton. Let's talk a little bit more about what you learned about that big sea change and the fantastic Premiership promotion last season.
Well, so going back to Kieran Maguire, I think we spoke to him before we got promoted, and it was just after the Bright Path Sports news broke. So that was huge. I mean, it felt insane at the time. It was like, hold on, the club was bought for about 30 million 2 years previously, or 3 years. No, 2 years previously. 3, sorry. And then all of a sudden it's worth 6 times that amount. It's really weird to think about. And I think, look, every step, every decision they've taken, it feels like it's been the right one. Like I say, the communication has been the big thing that's helped them, like drag people along. And you've got somebody in Mark Ashton who doesn't hide his ambition, who clearly has learned a lot from his previous roles. Like we dip into some of his past stuff with Bristol City and things in the podcast and get their kind of perspective on it. But, Mark Ashton clearly has learned. He's done incredibly.
The results
right?
speak for themselves,
and
not just on the pitch. The transformation of the ground is incredible. I mean, he talks a lot about how decayed it was as a place, and of course, just very recently, we're now seeing the final plans for the new training ground. So the investment continues. It's not just on the pitch, and here we are. We had the eyes of the world on Portman Road recently, and we gave Manchester United a fantastic game and perhaps should have won. So, well, listen, let's look to start to close out. I mean, I really enjoyed the podcast documentary. I got a lot of insights around it. I like the fact that it had the focus on the town itself. I thought some of the talking heads or the voices were very interesting as well. And I'd just like to close by asking, what were the 3 key takeaways you had from doing, which must have been a very involved project? What are the 3 things that you took away from it, please?
It was a very involved project. It was brilliant. It was a pleasure to do because I'm talking about things that I really, care about, obviously. So, my hometown and the football club. I had incredible support from the production company, the producers 2020 Recordings, who did an incredible job of just supporting me on the journey. The sound design and editing on the podcast, I think you'll agree, is great. And that's down to those guys. And I thank them a lot for it. But the things in terms of what I learned, I think, first of all, there's a lot in Ipswich that kind of is fairly underground and untapped. There's a lot of potential there, and there's already people on the ground, I think, doing a lot of work to change the perception of the place around. Suffolk is seen as this beautiful kind of area you want to go to. Ipswich is not, and that's kind of always been the case. So I think there's a lot of people that want to kind of change that, which is really, really encouraging, and we obviously meet a lot of those in the podcast. I think another thing is kind of opening up that question of what the role of a football club is, what the responsibility of a football club is to a place. Mark Ashton's thoughts are really interesting about that because he's challenging the club to go with him. The town to go with him, and I think he's saying that fairly directly to people, and that's not the first time he's done it. So I think that's quite unique to Ipswich. We've often had this kind of we'll just leave things as we are sort of thing, whereas now there are people there who are ambitious for the place as well. So that's really exciting. And I think, I don't know, the third thing is that there's a lot of people who care. And we did a launch event for this podcast a week before it went out in the town, and we were there with people who had contributed to the podcast and hadn't, and who were just there as kind of interested parties. And everyone really, really cares about kind of bringing the town up. There's potential there. It can be something that it has probably never been before. And I think that's very, very exciting.
Yeah. And I think, that point you make at the fans forum recently, Mark Ashton made that point, is can the town come in step with Ipswich? And I think that's fantastic. And Richard, thanks so much for joining us on TWTV. I want to just say that I think you picked out your production team there. I think it sounds really well produced and it's got a lovely style to it. So thanks again. A great show. And I look forward to, I think your plan is to maybe look at other clubs. Where do you go from here?
Yeah, so this is the first series of Rolling with the Punches. Obviously, Ipswich is very much the focus. And we hope it does resonate with people who aren't Ipswich either fans or are from other places, because I think, you know, football clubs are run differently all over the country, but at the same time there are similarities, and there are towns and places like Ipswich who need as much support as ours does. So yeah, the plan is to go to other places. There are many football clubs with loads of different interesting stories. So hopefully next year we'll move around and see what else is going on in the world of football.
Fantastic. Well, listen, thanks for coming on and telling us about the podcast documentary. And thank you for joining us for another segment on TWTV. And we look forward to speaking to you after the next game. And please like and subscribe.